Now, there is a time for describing options, and there's a time for reaching conclusions. And we now live in a day when conclusions about resource allocation must be made because people's lives are at stake. And Professor Arthur Dyke has just made a powerful case for resisting the temptation to ration where not rationing is an option. At the same time, we know that situations arise where some form of allocation is necessary. For example, in more developed countries, when people are dying because not enough organs are available for transportation and decisions must be made. Or in less developed countries, where people are dying because not enough antibiotics are available to treat people in need. I remember well from the year-long study that I carried out in Africa on healthcare resource allocation. One of the scarcest resources of all was simply the physician and the physician's time. One physician in a small healthcare center, in fact, was all too typical. She described for me a scene that arose in her practice weekly on average, where she would be caring for an infant who was desperately ill, and she knew that she had to give that infant her undivided attention throughout the night or that child would die. And partway through the evening, a husband and wife would walk into the healthcare center with their infant cradled in their arms, desperately ill, needing her undivided attention if that child was to live, and she had to decide which child would live. She herself, in her body, in her person, was the intensive care unit. Now, other allocations, particularly in more developed countries like the United States, take place because we simply decide we'd rather spend resources needed for health care on other enterprises or initiatives or wants or desires. And when that happens, we're forced to find ways to steer resources away from some people and toward others. Now, the root problem in such cases can easily be misplaced priorities at the macro allocation level. But once such macro priorities have been established and the healthcare resource pot is limited, then tough allocation decisions have to be made when we encounter it at that point in the decision-making scale. So while we're addressing the ethics of rationing at the macro level, we are still left inevitably with tough decisions concerning who will receive what's available. Now, in two books, Who Lives, Who Dies, which is written from a broad public perspective, and Life on the Line, which is written from an explicitly biblical Christian perspective, I've worked to identify and to discuss 17 major allocation criteria that are being used today, that are documentably used today to determine who does get and who does not get treatment. And you've received a handout, if you pick the one up that's just outside the door, or you can get it on your way out, which describes those various allocation criteria. And there's an asterisk beside those that, after wrestling with those criteria, I would suggest do have biblical warrant in constructing an overall approach to resource allocation. But my concern tonight is not to develop such an overall approach, but to challenge us to understand and to resist three criteria, which are often employed, but which allow allocation to go on unnoticed by most people. But they represent unethical approaches to allocation, which must be resisted on Christian and non-Christian bases alike. If society can be convinced on these 3 points, I would suggest, then there may be an openness to searching for a better way, an overall alternative. The first of these criteria is a social value criterion. Now, what I'm going to do for each of these criteria is put out the results of a study that I conducted nationally in the United States. It involved many hundreds of directors, medical directors of centers around the country. It preserved anonymity, but it allowed them to indicate what criteria they actually used when they were forced to make allocation decisions such as this. And so what was documented here is not only an average score, which gives a feel for the importance they attach to the criterion, but also a figure of what percentage of the directors indicated that this criterion plays some role in their allocation decisions. And as you can see here, 56% of the directors indicated that a social value criterion played some role in their allocation decisions. Some sort of assessment, and again, this was an honest acknowledgement, anonymously, about what really shaped and informed the decision-making. And this number, this percentage, indicated that this criterion, some sort of sensitivity to the value that various people had to society or the implications of their decision-making for the benefit of society, played some role in their decision-making. Now, it's almost impossible to imagine, in a way, an explicit social value rationing or allocation criterion operative. Yet, as the study shows, many decision-makers will anonymously admit that they are, in fact, influenced by this criterion today when they're deciding who gets limited resources. And the reason for the criterion's influence, I would suggest, is that we live in an increasingly utilitarian culture in which people are subtly valued in terms of their social usefulness rather than in terms of their intrinsic significance as creations of God. Now, the reasons why social value criteria need to be rejected must be clearly understood so that decision makers will lean against their cultural propensity to be influenced by them, either consciously or unconsciously, in their decision-making. And I would like to stress 4 problems with the social value criterion that really stand out. First of all is its unfairness. For social value considerations to be fairly applied, every possible social value contribution involved, even the most intangible, would have to be ranked, not just in terms of the present needs of society, but also in terms of the needs of the indefinite future. And then potential recipients of healthcare resources would have to be scrutinized down to the last detail of their personal lives, and the total impact of their lives on the lives of others would have to be assessed. We're so foolish sometimes in what we think we have the capacity to do. A small plane was beginning to falter. Its engine was just about to conk out. And the pilot came back into the cabin and said, "This plane is going down. And we only have 3 parachutes, and there are 4 of us. I'm a father with 6 young children at home, and I have to live." So he reached into the closet, grabbed one of those parachutes, and jumped out the door. Well, one of the other passengers stood up immediately and said, "Well, I'm the smartest man in the world. I mean, I have developed all these inventions. I have all of these ideas that have yet to be realized. I've got to live." And so he reached into the closet, took a parachute, jumped out the door. Well, there were 2 people left, a pastor and a young girl. And the pastor turned to the girl and said, "I've lived a good life. I'd like for you to take the remaining parachute." She said, "Don't worry, Pastor. We both have parachutes." He said, "How can that be?" Well, she said, "Well, the smartest man in the world grabbed my knapsack out of the closet and jumped." And we think that we can possibly know everything about people and the ultimate significance of their actions. Needless to say, this enterprise would require an omniscience and a wisdom that God alone has. That's why a social value criterion for allocation is sometimes rejected as playing God, because literally, God is the only one who could apply such a criterion justly. The second problem with the social value criterion has to do with discrimination. Those groups of people who are inherently limited in their social contributions, such as people who are disabled from birth, necessarily fare poorly under a social value criterion. Others contribute little because they have previously been denied educational opportunities or economic opportunities due to their race or their gender or their socioeconomic class. For them, past discrimination would be compounded by a social value criterion that now would deny healthcare resources to them on that basis. Now, while discrimination is wrong from many perspectives, this discrimination is particularly odious from the perspective of a God whom the Bible portrays especially concerned for the needs of the poor and the powerless, those whom society devalues. A third problem with the social value allocation criterion has to do with disrespect. I mean, the very nature of a social value criterion demeans human dignity. It robs people of their unconditional worth as creatures of God, and it defines them purely in terms of their value to others. It reduces the unique significance of human life to the interchangeable value of things. People are viewed as mere machines, ultimately, best left unrepaired when it's no longer efficient to fix them. And a fourth problem with a social value criterion has to do with distrust. Trust is a critical foundation of the physician-patient relationship and any caregiver-patient relationship. It develops as patients become convinced that physicians are making medical recommendations that are genuinely in the patient's best interests. Trust is essential if patients are to reveal the kinds of personal information, embarrassing symptoms, lifestyle habits, etc., that the physician needs in order to make an accurate diagnosis. But social value thinking undercuts that trust, as unflattering information becomes the basis for denying patients treatment rather than treating them more effectively. Now, the movement toward managed care only heightens this distrust to the degree that patients sense a gradual erosion of a wholehearted commitment to meeting their medical needs, caused by an increasing openness to saving society's resources at the patient's expense. Patients know deep down that death is the ultimate economy in healthcare. So that's one criterion I think we need to be very careful about. A second criterion is that of quality of life. Now, this is sometimes referred to as quality of life, qualitative prognosis, quality of benefit. As you can see in the U.S. study, it not only received a much greater emphasis, but the vast majority of directors indicated that this factors into their decision making. Now, the key idea behind this consideration is that those whose quality of life following treatment will be the lowest should be the first to be denied resources. Now, when Oregon developed its first so-called Medicaid rationing proposal, explicit quality of life standards played a significant role. And when this proposal was rejected by the federal government because of the way that such standards discriminated against people with disabilities, the proposal was rewritten with quality of life considerations playing a more disguised role. The current debate over so-called medical futility similarly involves quality of life standards. Healthcare professionals and financiers are understandably concerned about providing treatment that can't possibly benefit the patient. But agreements to deny such treatments in some settings has led to a consideration of also denying treatments to patients that will only sustain a low quality of life, designating them futile as well. There's a difference between low quality and no quality. Imposed so-called objective allocation standards of quality of life are problematic for many reasons, and I just want to take the time here to identify again 4 of those reasons. First of all, a quality of life allocation standard is unworkable. Not only is the task of identifying every qualitative aspect of all people's experience daunting, but quantifying such experiences on the same scale in order to compare them is even more unrealistic. There's an unworkability problem. There's also the problem of this criterion being oppressive. In particular cases where healthcare professionals or payers are making decisions about a patient's quality of life, you'd think that they would at least be able to reasonably assess or judge what that quality of life is. But numerous studies now have documented that externally observable indicators of someone's quality of life, and thus people's judgment about patients' quality of life, do not correlate with patients' own experience of their quality of life. So others are imposing their mistaken judgments on others concerning what their quality of life is. Now, such oppression happens on a large scale when attempts are made to formulate society-wide standards or a society-wide standard ranking of quality of life experiences, in which the experience of the majority, of course, outvotes the experience of minorities, such as persons with disabilities or other groups. Secondly, then, a problem of the oppressive nature of the criterion. Thirdly, a quality of life allocation criterion is dishonest. All too often, as experience has demonstrated, a judgment that a patient's quality of life would be too low with further treatment is really a statement that the patient would be too burdensome to continue to care for. It's more a statement about the caregiver's quality of life than it is about the quality of life of the patient. Or the judgment really may be a veiled application of the social value criterion that we looked at a few minutes ago. The patient's quality of life will be so low that he or she will provide little benefit to anyone in exchange for the precious resources that are being consumed for their care. And there's a fourth difficulty with the quality of life criteria. That's the fact that they are misguided. People's quality of life is an important matter in general, and it's important for healthcare in particular to be very concerned about quality of life. That's important to affirm from the outset. But low quality of life, in biblical or other humane perspectives for that matter, provides a mandate for creative efforts to enhance that quality, not a justification for denying even that quality which remains. The point here is that there are fixed ethical points in our resource allocations, and respecting life as created in the image of God is one of them. I recently read about the following situation. 2 battleships assigned to the training squadron had been on heavy weather maneuvers for several days. Because the visibility was poor with patchy fog, sounds like today's weather, doesn't it? The captain remained on the bridge, keeping an eye on all activities. Shortly after dark, the lookout on the wing of the bridge reported, "Steady light on starboard bow." That meant the 2 ships were on a collision course. The captain called to the signalman, "Signal that ship, we are on a collision course. Advise you change course 20 degrees. Back came the signal, "You should change course 20 degrees. The captain said, "Send, I'm a captain, change course." "I'm a seaman second class," came the reply. "You had better change the course." Now, by that time, the captain was furious. He spat out, "Send, I'm a battleship, change course 20 degrees. Back came the flashing light, "I'm a lighthouse." In the darkness of utilitarian quality of life calculations, what I'm suggesting is we must not lose sight of the fact that respect for life itself is a fixed point that we must take into account. So quality of life allocation criteria, whether operating explicitly or implicitly, must be carefully guarded against, because such criteria are unworkable, oppressive, dishonest, and misguided. Quality of life itself, though, must remain ever a very important goal and concern of healthcare, fostered for each patient in the ways that best meet the needs and the experiences of that patient. The third and the final allocation criteria that I want to comment on this evening is that of age, especially limiting healthcare resources to elderly patients. Now again, you can see in the study, it became evident that there was a significant emphasis, a lesser degree of emphasis, but a significant emphasis being placed on this criterion today, if people are honest, and a large percentage of the directors indicated that this played some role in their thinking about how priorities should be carried out. In recent years, proposals have increasingly been made, and actions have in fact been taken to limit the life-sustaining health care available for older persons, and that's documented in the literature. Now the question here is, why this growing openness to limiting certain resources available to elderly people? Well, one reason, I believe, lies in the political sphere, where elderly people and their needs are viewed rather strangely. It's noted correctly that while plenty of attention and resources are devoted to the acute care needs of older persons, their needs for long-term care and palliative care are often neglected. The answer, some say, is to cut back on their life-sustaining acute care so that more resources can be devoted on their other needs. But why is this trade-off restricted to the ranks of the elderly people? Why aren't all people asked to give up some acute care so that all might have better long-term care and palliative care? Well, the answer may lie in the way that elderly people are viewed as a single, undifferentiated block, despite studies that show a tremendous diversity in terms of the abilities and needs of elderly persons. Now, at first, that overlooking of that diversity was a political benefit to older people because it resulted in an array of legal entitlements, whether persons needed them or not, because they were just treated and viewed as a block. But now, this overlooking of diversity among elderly people, and in fact, overlooking similarities of need across different age groups, it's cutting the other way. And elderly people are at risk of being singled out for limitations on the healthcare resources that are available for them when they're in medical need. Now again, we may wonder, why elderly people? Is there something else going on here? Well, indeed there is, and it surfaces rather clearly in the economic sphere. The mushrooming numbers of elderly people today are commonly cited. Huge numbers mean huge costs, and healthcare is getting too expensive. So, let's limit certain forms of care to elderly people. But there are many reasons for the skyrocketing costs of healthcare. Why focus on this one limited factor when the proposed response, age-based allocation of healthcare, may prove fatal to them? Well, it's similarly complained that mushrooming numbers means that elderly people are receiving a, quote, disproportionate share of healthcare resources today. But disproportionate to what? Not disproportionate to need. So why should age per se matter? Well, one crucial answer I would suggest lies in the utilitarian mindset that is so influential and increasingly influential in the United States and U.S. culture today, and is well documented in the literature. That mindset dictates that people's value is based on what they contribute to society fundamentally. Achievement and economic productivity are highly valued in the United States and in many industrialized nations around the world, so that those who contribute most in those terms are those who are most worthy of being sustained by society's resources. Now, is this the outlook everywhere in the world? Well, the importance of answering that question is what prompted me to spend that year studying resource allocation challenges and approaches in Africa, among the Akamba people of Kenya in particular. Now there, when they were faced with a choice between saving one of two people, one of whom was 75 years old and one was 20 years old, the response just intuitively and immediately was, well, of course you'd say the 75-year-old. My intuition, shaped out of a Western culture, were radically different, I'll let you know. But as we explored what was going on there behind their thinking, what quickly emerged was, in contrast to a U.S. sort of view that tended to focus on the individual, view people atomistically, look for that gross national product, which is the sum of all their individual contributions and productivity and economic achievements. The Akamba tended to look at society more in terms of a fabric of interpersonal relationships. That's what it was all about, in fact. and that the older one grew, the more one became interwoven into the fabric as one developed new relationships, and the more damage was done to that fabric by ripping that person out than a person who was much younger. Now, it's often pointed out that a utilitarian mindset is dangerous because it can justify any level of abuse or neglect of a particular group in society if doing so would benefit the majority in the process. But what's less often noted is that this mindset reflects and magnifies whatever cultural values happen to dominate in a particular place at a particular time. Now, if economic productivity overshadows personal relationship, as in much of the West, then woe to the tired, especially the retired. Now, of course, the various proposals for age-based rationing that have been put forward today are sophisticated and have many diverse arguments and aren't put forward necessarily if they're argued explicitly on blatant utilitarian grounds. The most prevalent of the arguments that comes forward is a medical type of justification, in which elderly patients are to be denied treatment because their medical benefit, if treated, is less likely to take place, or it will be less long in benefit, or it'll be lower in quality or degree. Now, if that's really the justification of what's going on in a particular allocation, then it's the various forms of medical criteria that are involved here, not age criteria per se. Such proposed medical criteria need to be examined in their own right, in fact, and not be slipped in under the guise of age criteria. The appeal of genuine age criteria, ultimately and intuitively, is that those who are left without treatment are ultimately more expendable than others, to be quite blunt, that no significant social harm will come from sacrificing them for the good of the whole. Older people, then, in this way of thinking, join persons with disabilities and other socially disvalued groups in the rank of the vulnerable, for whom God has special concern. Age, quality of life, social value, those are three examples of allocation criteria which must be aggressively opposed so that they'll neither be explicitly adopted nor unconsciously applied, which is equally a danger, as the inevitable pressures grow under managed care to limit healthcare expenditures. Now, will our efforts succeed in provoking a thorough reform of healthcare allocation policy? Well, managed care will not be changed quickly. It's been around for a long time, in fact. You do remember this scene in the Gospels, don't you? But Joseph, why must we travel to Bethlehem? Well, that's the location of our primary healthcare HMO provider. Congressman Claude Pepper was an advocate of healthcare reform all his life. And someone asked him late in life whether he thought that substantial healthcare reform would ever occur. Yes, he replied, but not in my lifetime. And he was right. And after he died, it's rumored that he went to heaven, and his first question to God was whether or not substantial healthcare reform would ever come. Yes, God replied, but not in my lifetime. Thorough reform of allocation policy may never occur, given the fallenness of the world in which we live. But faithfulness requires that we raise a clear voice reflecting godly values so that when the less valuable, the less lovely, the less youthful are left behind, they recognize God as their defender. And who knows, maybe the rumored conversation between God and Claude Pepper never took place. And God does have substantial reform ahead for us to bring about, if only we will be faithful. Thank you for your attention.